Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth edition of the SwissNext nexFrontier webinar series, which will be held on the topic of professional well-being and lifelong learning. My name is Nils Feldman, and I'm a project coordinator at SwissNext in China, the science consulate of Switzerland in China. As part of the global SwissNext network, we aim to connect Switzerland to China and the world in education, research, and innovation by supporting the outreach and active engagement of our partners in the international exchange of knowledge, ideas, and talent. nexFrontier is our latest webinar series, which spotlights cutting-edge research in Switzerland and China with a focus on the Swiss National Centers of Competence in Research, also known as the NCCRs, as well as leading research institutions in China. The aim is therefore to spark potential exchanges, as well as future collaborations. Today, we are delighted and honored to be joined by four prominent speakers from the NCCR Lives, the University of Zurich, the China-Europe International Business School, the University of Lausanne, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong, who will provide us with an exclusive insight into the latest trends and resources in professional well-being and lifelong learning. Just a quick reminder before we begin, we have a short Q&A session at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to use the Q&A interface at the end or at the bottom of the Zoom interface, and we will be happy to get back to you at the end of the session. This webinar is moreover being recorded, and we will share the recording on our social media platforms within the coming days. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Alexandra M. Freund. Professor Freund is currently a professor of psychology at the University of Zurich, and prior to that, had studied psychology at the University of Heidelberg and the Free University Berlin, where she also received her PhD. She was subsequently a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University before returning to Germany to co-direct a project on developmental regulation with Paul Baltes at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. After that, she was an associate professor and later an assistant professor, and then later an associate professor at Northwestern University. Professor Freund has moreover published more than 200 scholarly articles in the areas of developmental regulation, successful development and aging, and motivation across adulthood. Professor Freund, the floor is yours.
Can you see my slides now?
Yes, we can see that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this nice intro. And I have to say the brief video made me yearn for in-person meetings again. Thank you very much for this invitation, for giving me a chance to present some of the work that we have done at the NCCR Lives in Switzerland, where we look at conditions that foster the well-being of working adults and beyond, look at how people differ in fulfilling their capacities to their fullest. In my sub-project, I'm looking at processes of exhaustion and recovery, and I will lead you briefly through our journey of where we are at the moment. You've heard, particularly during this pandemic, COVID pandemic, a lot about boundary management, that yes, we need to work at home a lot in our home offices, but we need these boundaries where we have clear leisure time, because otherwise we will become too exhausted. We might even end up having burnouts or being so dissatisfied with work that we are no longer very productive. So the question is it really true that activities at work are exhausting and that leisure time is recovering? How much of these processes are, if I may say so, in our head? Are they self-fulfilling prophecies of our subjective expectations? And to start, why don't you think for a moment about your lay theory of energy? Because energy for most of us is highly related to exhaustion, so the term of exhaustion and recovery. Namely, if we spend our energy, we might be exhausted. If we recharge our energy, we might feel recovered. And there are clearly two poles in the spectrum of limited versus unlimited lay conceptions of energy. Do you yourself think more about energy as being stored in a battery? So if you spend it, the battery is empty and you need to recharge it or get a new battery. Or is energy for you more like a flow of water that comes out of a well, and it springs and it springs and it springs, and you don't need to recharge it. It's there and you can tap into it, but you don't need to recharge it in a way. And it only stops when the well is empty, and that would be in this picture, death. And speaking of death, I hope we're not there, but we come all closer to death as we age. Namely, are there age-related differences? What are your expectations there? Do you expect, as many do, that older adults are really tired? And there is a saying in German that if you are really tired, you say, I'm not getting old today. And that means I'm going to retire to bed early. So we have old age being very closely related to being exhausted. Or do you think actually of the younger ones being those who are couch potatoes and they can't do anything and they're so easily exhausted, they still have to learn how to manage their energy, and the springy older adult? So we've investigated this, and when I say we, it's Brian Cardini, a former doctoral student and then postdoc with me at the University of Zurich, who was affiliated with LIFES also, where we assessed the lay theories with a scale, and an item would read, my stamina fuels itself. Even after strenuous exertion, I can continue doing more. If you give this a very low score, you would have a limited lay theory. If you say, yes, absolutely, that is me, you would have a unlimited theory of energy. We've asked younger, middle-aged, and older adults these questions, and here's what we found. We found that actually the younger adults are more limited in their theory of energy. So they're more actually the slouches and couch potatoes. And the older adults are actually more the people who think of themselves as having a lot of energy. Well, you might say it's all in their heads. And we need to know, do these lay theories actually hold when engaging in an exhausting activity? And we did this by asking people to engage in a very strenuous workout for 20 minutes and high intensity interval training. And we interrupted this every 2 minutes and asked people several questions about how they were doing at the moment. Afterwards, and immediately adjacent to this, we had a recovery period where we led people through a mindful-based relaxation. And again, after 2 minutes, we asked them how they were doing. What did we assess? How recovered are you? How exhausted are you physically, mentally? How much would you like to do something else? Opportunity cost. How interested are you in the activity? What is your mood? What is your time perception? But for now, we will look at just like the physical exhaustion and recovery. So what did we, again, we had people, we invited them into our lab where they did the actual training with us, and then the relaxation period, again, young, middle-aged, and older adults. And here's what we found during the exhaustion period, that's the period when they engaged in this high interval training. We found that in fact, people became more and more exhausted. But interestingly, for older adults, as you can see, they are in green here, they become exhausted faster. But in the end, everybody's exhausted to the same degree. After around 10 minutes, there are no age-related differences anymore. And even here in the earlier periods, you see the differences aren't big. And they recovered just as fast as younger and middle-aged adults do. So you see that what they report is not wrong. They do not have a very limited energy level at their disposal. How are exhaustion and recovery related to these lay theories? I've shown you the lay theories, I've shown you the actual recovery and exhaustion, but how are they related? To look at this, we've developed a process model of the subjective expectations of exhaustion and recovery. So we start, and when I say we here, it's Victoria Schüttengruber and myself, and she is a doctoral student in the NCCR Lives. We start with how do we think of our activities as belonging to a certain life domains? How do we know that we're working right now versus having a leisure time? I mean, listening to a talk can be either or, giving a talk can be either or. So we went through the literature and identified the main cues that are typically named for identifying life domains, and said that those probably say whether it's for you paid work or leisure, whether you're autonomous or not. If you're not autonomous, more likely it's work for you. Leisure might be characterized by being autonomous. What do you want to achieve? Do you want to make money with this, or do you just do it for fun? Where do you do it? In your office? Do you watch a Netflix series in your office? Might still be sort of work because you're in the office, not sure. And so on. So we went through this and said like these cues probably contribute to whether you think of something as being work or leisure. Whether, you think about this as work or leisure triggers or activates certain expectations, namely probably the expectation of something being exhausting or recovering. And we believe that probably paid work, we think it's exhausting, and leisure is probably recovering. So if you think of an activity such as searching on the internet for the newest COVID-19 cases, you can do this for work, or you can do this for leisure. I mean, it's not pleasant leisure, but it's still leisure if you don't need it for work. So when do we think of this as being more exhausting? And this should trigger a selective attention process where now that you expect something to be very exhausting, you look for signs of exhaustion. If you expect something to be recovering, you look for signs of recovery. So if I expect you to be friendly, I look for a friendly face. If I expect you to be angry, I look for signs of anger. And we all know that we do this all the time. Unfortunately, we expect something and then we look exactly for those signs. And that leads to what we call often the self-fulfilling prophecies. And we are saying this in turn actually determines how much energy you feel you have already spent. So that will then lead you to compute, not on a conscious level, but unconsciously, a subjective value of the activity. Is it worth what I'm doing? Should I continue or not? Is it worth what I'm doing? I'm spending so much energy on looking up these numbers. Should I actually, how much worth is it to me, given on how much I invest into this? And this is related to opportunity costs. What are opportunity costs? They are, should I continue with what I'm doing? Do I like what I'm doing? Or are the costs like I would rather be doing something else? So in this workout study that I've shown you, we actually asked people for doing this. For telling us how exhausted they, how much they would like to do something else or continue. And what you can see here is that, in fact, when they get exhausted, during that time, the more exhausted they get during this period, the higher the opportunity cost, the more they feel like I would rather be doing something else. And that's actually even true for the recovery period. So first they think like, oh my God, this is wonderful, the recovery. I would not want to do anything else. But then after you're recovered for a while, you feel like, okay, now enough. Let me do something else. And we all know this. If we do too much of a recovery, we feel like, okay, let's do something else now. This in turn, and that's where it's really important also for work and productivity, leads to not only how recovered or exhausted do I feel, but the decision to continue or abandon. So let's first look at the life domains and the expectations. Is the association truly work-related activities are exhausting and leisure activities are recovering? And we've asked this 315 working adults. And what we found was, in fact, when we ask for physical exercise, you have meetings, you read something and you research something in the internet, the green bars are work, you feel exhausted or you expect to be exhausted with these activities if you perform that at work, but far less if you do the same activities during leisure. And here is an interesting result, namely the same activities can be recovering or exhausting. So if you exercise for work, it's exhausting and it's more recovering when you do it for leisure. So here we see that if you do these activities for leisure, not only are they less exhausting, but they're also more recovering. What makes the activities work or leisure related? Maybe they're just different. Maybe you search in a different way for numbers of COVID-19 at work or at leisure. So we've asked ourselves, what are these cues that make you decide whether it's work or leisure? And we've assessed this in a study with vignettes where the only thing that we varied were the cues, right? Everything else was the same. And here what we found, the most potent predictor of when you say it's work versus leisure was the goal that you're pursuing. If you say, I'm doing this for the purpose of leisure, then it's leisure. If you say, I'm doing this for my work stuff, then it's work. All the other predictors are not half as important as that. So the goal that you pursue is most important. And we found that, in fact, the expectation that work is exhausting, the degree to which you say something is work determines how much you say it's exhausting. The degree to which you say something is recovering is leisure, the more recovered you feel. So it does seem, in fact, that the subjective expectations guide importantly how much we feel something is work versus leisure and how much it is exhausting versus recovery. To sum up, lay theories: young adults feel their energy is more limited than those of older adults. Older adults are not more exhausted after strenuous exercise than young adults, and they recover just as fast. People expect leisure to be exhausting, relaxing, recovering, and work to be exhausting, even for the exact same activity. And in our future work, and this is where we go from here, we will investigate these behavioral consequences. When do people stop working on or doing what they're doing? And we are in the process of the study where we're tracking people in their everyday activities at work and during leisure to substantiate the question of boundary management. And with this, I would like to thank for the invitation to give the talk here, you for bearing with me and listening to my talk, Brian Cardini and Victoria Schittenkruber for working with me, and my entire team. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Freund, for the very interesting talk. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our second speaker, Professor Emily M. David. Professor David is an associate professor of organizational behavior at the China-Europe International Business School. She has published over 20 peer-reviewed articles in a number of prestigious outlets on the topics of diversity and pro-social employee behavior, co-authored a book chapter on evolving work behavior patterns in the Cambridge Handbook of the Changing Nature of Work, and is even a forthcoming full-length book called Innovative to the Core. Prior to living and working in China, Professor David moreover served as an associate professor and discipline leader of the HR and management faculty in Dubai, and also served in applied roles in both the MD Anderson Cancer Center and NASA. Professor David, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. Get this shared here. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming to see this talk. Thank you, Dr. Freund, for that incredible talk. Very interesting research and actually a really good segue into what I'm going to be talking about, which is essentially how we can get more energy while we're at work. So it worked out that I'm right after you. I'd want to take a second to thank my co-authors on this paper. It's Lars Johnson at Wayne State University and Sarah Perry at Baylor University. We actually started this research back in 2019 when we noticed that a lot of people were kind of going to this third place in order to engage in work. And of course, this was before COVID, whenever a lot of us were forced to work from home. But this was whenever co-working spaces are these kind of member-based systems where people go in and work in kind of an open plan space with people who might not be their real coworkers. We wanted to see that because there wasn't a lot of research out there, how people are interacting in these spaces and what are the benefits of some of these different interactions over time. So as I said, we noticed this huge trend, and this was something not just in the United States and Europe, but we also saw a huge explosion of these co-working spaces in China. So you can see up to 2019, and of course, a lot of this got a little interrupted with COVID, but really exponential growth in terms of the percentage of people who were working in these co-working spaces. And in China, we had a whole bunch of homegrown ones. A lot of our actual alumni from SEEBS started companies. Ucommune is one. In Shanghai, we had Naked Hub for a while before they got taken over by WeWork. So we really wanted to get into this because there was so little academic literature on how people were actually doing work in these novel spaces. And so we think that this is something that's going to continue as COVID kind of abates, particularly as we all got used to working away from the traditional office setting. And hopefully this study gives a little snapshot into what are some of the potential benefits and who is most likely to benefit from these spaces. Okay, so you can see kind of a typical layout here of a co-working space. And some of the questions that we had were particularly centered around helping, or what kind of interactions are people having. So a lot of the sales materials that we have inside of these spaces is basically like, oh, you can meet a lot of really cool people for your network. You can get a lot of feedback on your projects if you're a freelancer and these kind of things. But we wanted to know if those kind of collaborations were actually happening. We also wanted to see whether or not people helping you differed in a substantial way from something like small talk. So much like what we just heard about, this concept of energy, we looked at something called vigor, which is kind of the positive energy that you have that you can put towards your work. And a lot of the people in some of the existing papers that are out there, there's a qualitative study that a lot of people talked about how they like to go to these places because they're invigorated or they're energized by being around the buzz of other people, as opposed to just working in their basement, for example. And so we wanted to know, is it the being helped that is the invigorating part, or is it just small talk, talking about the weather, being physically around other warm bodies? So this was another thing that we wanted to explore. We also wanted to see what kind of help people were giving. And so we talked about co-working specific forms of help. And then finally, we wanted to look at moderators in terms of who is most likely to benefit from working in these unique co-working spaces. So when we talk about emotions in the workplace, there's a very famous theory called affective events theory, or AET, and we use specifically the dual process model of this. And so basically what AET, particularly the dual process model, says is that the emotions we experience at work can impact our behavior. And we go through two pathways when we're talking about emotions at work. There's the primary appraisal, or that kind of gut feeling that we get. So immediately when you get angry, you have an immediate reaction to that. So we see that sometimes our behavior is just triggered automatically by emotion, but also there's some long-term kind of ways that emotion impacts us. So sometimes we might, kind of feel happy during the day. We go back, we reflect on why we felt happy, whether or not we'll feel happy in the future. And so this kind of deeper processing or secondary appraisal of the emotion can give us some kind of longer term attitudes and also some behavior. behaviors. So we wanted to look at both the automatic effect of these spaces and also the longer term. So the way that we studied this, we used a daily diary survey method where we took people who were working in co-working spaces in China, Europe, and the US, and we basically gave them surveys 3 times a day over a 5-day working period. And we also surveyed them about a month later to get some outcomes from them. But this allowed us to really say, okay, if someone gets helped in a given day, does it affect them immediately on that day? And also on the average over the longer time period, do we see some kind of outcomes in terms of vigor because of that? So I mentioned we wanted to look at different kinds of help, particularly the ones that would happen here. So we dug into the literature a little bit and we looked at some of the taxonomies that they had out there, and we only kept the types that we thought really kind of conceptually made sense in terms of how people would help each other. Because in the normal OB or IO-psych literature, we have things like organizational citizenship behavior, which is basically, okay, you're my coworker, we have the same goals, we're trying to get to the same place, so I'm going to help you out if you need. But in this setting, it's not exactly like that. These people might not be coworkers at all. They might not be even in the same industry or have the same job. So we thought that the 4 kind of most likely types of help that we would see would be helping people with their problems, giving other people emotional support or just letting them vent, giving them feedback on their work, and introducing them to important network contacts. And so we wanted to, as another analysis, just kind of see which one of these types of help is most important. But essentially what we thought, probably as you would expect, is that if someone helps you in these co-working spaces, either in the moment or over the longer term, we think it's going to be a positive event. We think it's actually going to be invigorating. It's going to give you energy because it means that you belong, that you're someone who's worthy of help. It gives you resources and support if you need it. So overall, for a variety of reasons, we thought that this would be a positive thing. So these are the first 2 hypotheses that we looked at, basically either in the moment, so help received by midday would affect that evening's vigor scores, or even once you average them over the whole week, more help received means that you would have more vigor or energy. Okay, the other thing that we wanted to look at was what kinds of people are going to be most invigorated whenever they get help. So based on something called self-verification theory, we looked at self-esteem as a potential moderator. And self-verification theory, just to kind of summarize it very briefly, is that we like other people to see us the same way we see ourselves. So if we have good feelings about ourselves, we want other people to see us like that also. And even if we feel like we have very bad self-concept or very low self-esteem, we want other people to also see that. So that way it's consistent and there's no cognitive dissonance there. So in general, we thought that even though helping is a positive thing, as we just saw, it should give people energy. We thought that people with high self-esteem would really be much more likely to benefit from getting help, right? So they see themselves as a positive person, as a person to be liked and helped. So when they get that help from other people, it's very much aligned with their expectations. And so we expect them to be invigorated. However, when someone who has low self-esteem gets help, it's not aligned with their self-concept. It says, okay, well, no, I'm not someone who's worthy of help or of being liked. So this is inconsistent with the way I view myself. They might even start to view the help as a reflection that they are not competent enough or that they can't really do it by themselves without getting help. So they have some negative feeling about that. That might kind of mute the energy that they would otherwise get from being helped. So in sum, the third hypothesis we looked at was people who have high self-esteem, when they get help in co-working spaces, they're going to have more vigor than people with low self-esteem. Okay, and the final piece to the puzzle that we looked at in this study was, okay, so you get energized, so what, right? What are you going to do about it? And the major outcome that we assessed a month later was intent to quit the co-working space. And usually in the OB literature, when we look at turnover, it's, are you thinking of leaving your job? Which means leaving the physical space of your office and leaving your job. So you have to go get employment somewhere else. Quitting the co-working space is a little bit different, particularly in the case of freelancers. A lot of times quitting the actual space just means you're going to go work on your same job somewhere else. So it's just about quitting the physical context. And so it's a little bit different, but we do know that in general, positive emotions make you want to stay where you are. And so this is basically what we thought also, is that if people are getting help in these spaces, they're feeling that invigoration either over the long term, then they're going to be much more likely to want to stay in that space and continue paying their membership fees. Okay, so I'm not going to go in a lot of details, but just to go through the results that we have. Basically, we found that in the moment, help received did positively impact vigor. So if you were helped on one day, that night you were going to feel a little bit more energized. An interesting thing, we also saw it on the longer term. And this one was even a stronger relationship. So once you give people a little time to reflect on the help that they're receiving, if they're consistently getting help over time, then they're going to be even more energized. We also found that there was a moderation of self-esteem. So we did find that even though everyone benefited from receiving help from others, we found that the people who had high self-esteem had much stronger positive relationships with vigor than people with low self-esteem. We also found that this energy or this vigor actually kept people from wanting to leave the space, right? So this is a very important implication for the owners of these kind of spaces, is that if you're encouraging people to help each other and you're encouraging these different bonds, people are invigorated, you're giving them this energy, they're not going to want to leave and go somewhere else. We also saw this mediation worked out. And so the only one that we didn't find support for was for the moderated mediation. So even though we did find the significant interaction on the first stage, we found that the mediation was so strong that in general, it didn't matter too much in terms of high or low self-esteem. All right, so just to kind of wrap this up, and the major points that I want to highlight from this particular research is that whenever you get help from other people, especially strangers or people who aren't even your actual coworkers, they have no real obligation to help you. Whenever you do receive that kind of help, you get energized, you get vigor. And the interesting thing is that we also measured small talk. So when people talk about the weather, or they talk about their weekend plans, or just something in passing when they're grabbing a cup of coffee. And we found that small talk didn't have any effects on vigor or on the chances that they wanted to stay in the co-working space. So it's not just about being around warm bodies. It's not just about having other people to talk to and not being isolated. It's actually the deeper, more meaningful receiving of help and resources from other people that gives them the energy and makes them want to stay. In terms of the 4 types of help that I broke down earlier, in our supplemental analyses, we also found that the 2 most important types were emotional support. So just, being a shoulder to cry on, giving people some place to vent, and the other one was giving them feedback on their work. All right, so telling them it's good or bad, how it can be improved. These were more important than helping them solve a problem or introducing them to the right people. And we did find that people who had high self-esteem benefited more, but the important thing here is that both did benefit. Both high and low self-esteem people were invigorated when other people helped them. It's just that high self-esteem people were able to leverage that into being more invigorated. And then finally, people who were more energized were much less likely to want to leave the co-working spaces. So they were able to continue to benefit from all those things that kind of helped them, and also the space continued to count them as a member. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you all for coming to the talk. Thank you for the invitation to speak here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the talks.
Thank you very much, Professor David, for the insightful talk. Now, I am very happy to introduce our third speaker, Professor Masudi. Professor Masudi is an associate professor in lifelong vocational psychology and a member of the Research Center in Vocational Psychology and Career Counseling at the University of Lausanne. He is also a senior researcher in the NCCR Lives, in which he co-leads a project on work-related resource and vulnerabilities. His research includes the study of contemporary career trajectories, psychosocial risk factors at the workplace, as well as work-related health and well-being. As a counseling psychologist and a career counselor, he moreover aims to implement evidence-based interventions to promote positive working conditions in organizations, as well as to support individuals to develop decent and meaningful careers. Professor Masudi, the floor is yours.
Sorry, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for this opportunity to present some of our work on contemporary careers here in Lausanne. I would like to start my presentation by very briefly and roughly presenting the Swiss context based on some paradoxical or contradictory observations. On the one hand, we have some performance indicators that show a very positive situation in Switzerland with a healthy and wealthy economy, a very resilient and stable labor market with low rates of unemployment that resist economic crisis or turbulences, and also a very sophisticated and high-performing education system that facilitates young workers' first steps into the labor market, and also their good fit between the labor market demands and the qualifications of the workforce. On the other hand, however, well-being indicators based on periodic studies show a more mitigated picture, a sort of trend towards deterioration of working conditions, more workload, more work pace, less opportunities to do a quality job or perform meaningful tasks, an increase in work-related ill-being indicators such as stress, strain, burnout, or perceived job insecurity, and also a certain level of social inequalities. For instance, a high correlation between pupils' school performances and their parents' socioeconomic status. So one could say that even though these performance indicators are very useful and helpful, they're insufficient to understand the needs of the workers engaged in the labor market. So let's take a look at these contemporary careers, what's going on today in the world of work and how people go through their career courses. For 3 decades now, we can observe a sort of de-standardization of these career courses. That is, they are less linear, less predictable, less structured based on certain ages, stages, or related work and social roles, and they are marked by more changes and transitions. So given that people can less rely on external landscape landmarks, they must put an accent on their own individual responsibility to manage and to develop their careers and develop their resources to cope with these transitions. This puts some at risk of insecurity or precarious work, but of course it offers others opportunities for fulfilling and meaningful careers. So a recent concept that is used today to understand and to study these career trajectories is that of sustainable careers, which implies these sequences of career experiences over time with a certain continuity, which should provide a sense of agency, being in control of one's career, and also bringing meaning to individuals, and thus leading to positive outcomes, both in terms of performance, in-role performance, employability, but also sustained well-being and health at work. The question I would like to raise with you today is this one: which individual and contextual factors, characteristics can contribute to sustainable careers and then act as resources or protective factors? To illustrate what I'm talking about here, this is what we have done in the framework of the NCCR Lives. We had the opportunity to follow a group of employed and unemployed adults in Switzerland through 7 years, try to understand each year what is their employment status, and also questioning some indicators in terms of well-being, employability, etc. And then we took our data and tried to identify different profiles or patterns of career progression. And this is what we got: a solution with 4 profiles, 4 different profiles. The first 2 on the top of the screen, we call them sustainable careers, either part-time or full-time. And when we tried to understand who belonged into these two profiles, all things being equal, gender was the main predictor. That is, women were overrepresented in a sustainable part-time career profile. And this may mean that there still is a sort of male breadwinner model that's going on in Switzerland, and women could be at risk of underemployment or experience difficulties when trying to reconcile family obligations and their career prospects and tasks. The third group, we called it the resilient group or profile. Here we had younger adults with a sufficient level of education. And as you can see, these people start a little bit badly, but then get back into tracks and into full employment. And this is what we can call a sort of a transitional or frictional unemployment, where the first steps into the labor market are a little bit delicate, and then things get back into track. The fourth group is what the one that concerned us the most, of course, because these people show some vulnerabilities and some sort of chaotic or unfavorable career progression with long periods of unemployment. And here, as you can imagine, this group was formed by older workers with lower education level. Females, women were also overrepresented in this profile, but there were also slight personality differences that I can discuss moreover. So let's move on to the part of individual characteristics or resources. This is what we mainly call psychological capital or resources. We know that there are individual differences in the capacity to make meaning, to make sense of experiences and events, and to cope with these events or demands, and also differences in the way people can be proactive, anticipate challenges to come, and efficiently cope with these difficulties or challenges. And we know that on the one hand, the concept here is sense of coherence, this capacity of giving positive meaning to challenges and events. It protects people from adversity at work, and it ensures work-related health. It protects people against burnout, for instance. And on the other hand, we know that career adaptability also helps people maintain high levels of subjective well-being, but it also prepares people to overcome work traumas. People that have higher career adaptability are more likely to retrieve a job after an unemployment period. So we know that there are some differences, individual differences. These qualities or resources do have an effect. But what we know also is that these two are not traits, stable traits, and they are pretty much affected by the environment that can be more or less supportive and support people to reinforce their resources or mobilize these resources. So the next question is, what is the role of the contextual factors, that is the work environment in terms of demands and resources that are available, and also the characteristics of our tasks. So here we also did a daily diary study. We asked people through 5 consecutive work days at 4 moments, random moments in their work day, what they were actually doing, which type of tasks they were performing, how they felt about it, and some questions about their job characteristics. And what we saw indeed is interesting, because on one hand, on the days people were considering that their tasks were stimulating, that is demanding and complex, they felt more engaged, and this was especially the case with people that had higher job autonomy. That is, this job resource moderates the effect between stimulation, the level of demands, and people's motivation or engagement at work. On the other hand, people also reported that when they were performing more meaningful tasks, these are tasks that are clearly aiming at clear goals and that have also some sort of social utility in them, then people felt more engaged. And this was particularly the case for people who had higher job variety. Here again, we have a job resource that moderates this effect. So it does matter which psychosocial working condition I work in order to enhance my sense of meaningfulness and my capacity to respond to demands and take control. In terms of future challenges, what we are working on right now, of course, as you can imagine, COVID has changed things a lot, and we are pretty much interested in the effects of these new ways of working. One can say in telework, which are these flexible ICT-based working arrangements, and how do they affect people's well-being and employability. We know that these new ways of work can have both beneficial or detrimental effects, depending on some characteristics of the populations we're studying. For instance, what we have found in our ongoing research is that there are some individual differences in how people appraise and approach novel technologies, and how they are willing and capable of updating their skills to adopt these technologies. And this brings to different effects in terms of well-being and employability, but also the fact that these new ways of working that were boosted through the pandemic, but that are likely to lead to some permanent modifications of our work methods, work conditions, the interactions we have with our supervisors and colleagues. These changes in the working conditions bring some specific challenges for workers, and their well-being depends on how well they can cope, or they're supported to cope with these challenges in terms of blurred work-life boundaries, difficulties in communications, and lack of interactions, which brings somewhat the feeling of being socially isolated, and also the difficulty to persevere and to maintain one's effort and performance because of a lack of feedback or monitoring of their performances. So I would like to finish with this slide. Based on our data, we're working with organizations, with career practitioners, and what we can say is that there are at least 3 levels of actions and measures to be taken. First, at an individual level, what we know in career counseling, thank you, Niels, I'm done, is that career interventions should support people's efforts to take control and to make meaning of their work experiences, and bring them to engage in lifelong career management and education, and not merely make a single long-term decision, a choice of a job or a work domain. At an organizational level, it appears that job redesigning and job crafting could help maximize job resources and bring people to perform interesting, fulfilling, and meaningful tasks. Management practices to facilitate the adjustment to these new ways of working, better feedback, monitoring, and also organizational climate to support, for instance, work-life balance. And at a structural level, the policymakers should be able to take some actions to reduce social inequalities and also support equal access to dignified and decent work for all. That is all. Thank you very much. And I'm open to questions after my colleague has presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Masudi, for the fascinating insights. And last, but certainly not least, I'm delighted to introduce our 4th and final speaker, Professor Xieming Gong. Professor Gong is a research assistant professor of the Big Data Decision Analytics Research Center and the Department of Psychology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Prior to that, he received a master's degree in psychology from Beijing Normal University in 2014, a PhD in psychology from the Chinese University of Hong Kong in 2017, and subsequently worked as a postdoctoral researcher with Professor Freund at the University of Zurich from 2017 to 2020. A major focus of his research includes adulthood development, as well as the psychology of aging, and he is particularly interested in motivational and emotional changes across adulthood, as well as cognitive health in late adulthood. Professor Gong, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Niels, for the introduction. In this talk, I'm going to present my work in collaboration with Professor Alexander Freund on changes in personal goals across adulthood, and I will discuss some implications of this research for lifelong learning. So here is the outline of the talk. So recently, there has been a lot of discussion about digital divide in the older population. So digital divide refers to the gap between those who benefit from digital technologies and those who do not. The popularity of digital technologies may have already caused a lot of challenges and difficulties to older adults in their daily lives. How to close the digital divide in the older population? One solution is to provide non-digital services to older adults. Another solution is to encourage and teach older adults to use devices and services. Regarding the second solution, so how can we promote the use and the learning of use of digital technologies in older adults? There has a lot of discussion about how to increase the usability and accessibility of digital devices and services to older adults, and how to increase the comprehensibility of learning and teaching materials. But there has been much less discussion about the goal and the motivation in older adults themselves about learning the use of digital technologies. Goal and motivation is one of the most critical factors that determine success in learning, according to a lot of research from psychology and education. That's why we should care about the changes in personal goals. We need to learn how goals change across adulthood and how the changes influence older adults' learning motivation and behavior. So how do personal goals change? Let's first roughly classify personal goals into three major categories. Goals oriented towards gains and growth, which refers to goals to acquire more resources and better functioning levels. For example, to acquire new knowledge, acquire new skills. Goals oriented towards maintenance refers to goals about maintaining acquired resources and the current state. People do not want to make any change to their lives, not become better, not become worse. Goals oriented towards loss avoidance. Goals to prevent loss of resources and decline in functioning levels, for example, to prevent diseases. The general finding from the literature is that younger adults have stronger goal orientation towards gains and growth. Older adults, they have stronger goal orientation toward maintenance and the loss avoidance. So for example, in this study, researchers asked younger and older adults to list 4 most important goals in their lives and ask them to rate the goal orientation of these goals. You can see in this figure, younger adults, they have stronger orientation towards growth, but old adults had the stronger goal orientation towards maintenance and loss avoidance. But this is the same case within specific life domains. So in the recent studies, we ask people of different ages to rate their goal orientation in 16 life domains. So as you can see in these figures, as the age increased, the gain orientation decreased, and the maintenance orientation increased, and the loss avoidance orientation slightly increased. So why do personal goals change? There are several hypotheses: the loss hypothesis, gain hypothesis, and also some studies emphasize the role of a sense of control. So in the end, we will propose a model to integrate this different type of hypothesis. So the loss hypothesis is basically based on the dominant theories about lifespan development, such as the selection, optimization, and the compensation model. So all these theories and models, they assume that losses increases with age, as shown in this figure. The gains become fewer and fewer, and losses become more and more. In general, human beings are loss averse. We want to counteract loss, and goals toward maintenance and loss avoidance help counteract loss. So that's one of the reasons why we change the goal orientation across adulthood. On the other hand, age-related increase in losses also constrains the possibility to grow and to achieve new gains, so which constrains the goal orientation towards striving for gains. This also contributes to the goal change. The gain hypothesis emphasizes the role of accumulation of resources. We hypothesize that accumulation of resources also increase with age, although the age-related increase. Although losses increase with age, so as shown in the figure, although gains become small, you can see the white area indicating the accumulated gains become more and more, although at the same time, losses become more and more. For older adults, they have more time and more opportunities to accumulate resources in many life domains. But comparatively, younger adults, they do not have, they have not had enough time and opportunities to do so. Older adults also experience higher level of satisfaction because they have gained more resources to meet their desired states, or they have lowered goal standards, so making their goals easier to meet results in higher level of satisfaction. Higher satisfaction make people increase people's motivation to maintain the status quo because they are satisfied with the status quo. In short, the loss hypothesis emphasizes what a person has lost or will lose. So it predicts that more losses are associated with stronger goal orientation toward maintenance and loss avoidance. The gain hypothesis, in contrast, emphasizes what a person owns. It predicts more gains and a higher level of satisfaction are associated with stronger goal orientation toward maintenance and loss avoidance. We have done a series of studies which provide some evidence to this hypothesis. So you can see in this figure, it describes the relationship between the perceived losses and the different types of goal orientation. So you can see as perceived losses increase, the gain orientation decrease, which make the goal orientation towards maintenance and avoidance relatively stronger in later adulthood for those people who experience more losses. So which partially support the loss hypothesis. And about this figure describes the relationship between accumulation of gains, satisfaction, and different types of goal orientation. So you can see more accumulated gains. It was associated with a stronger gain orientation, stronger maintenance and loss avoidance orientation. Higher satisfaction was associated with a weaker gain orientation, but stronger maintenance and loss avoidance orientation. So the gain hypothesis was supported. We also did several studies to establish the causal relationship between the satisfaction and the goal orientation. So you get this figure, you can see before we manipulate the participants' satisfaction, there were no differences in their goal orientation between the groups of participants. But after the manipulation of satisfaction, you can see those people who had lower satisfaction, they had a stronger growth or gain orientation, but weaker maintenance orientation compared to those participants in the high satisfaction group. We also tested the flow of sense of control. Sense of control refers to a person's belief about how much control they have over a given situation and the belief about the likelihood of obtaining desired outcomes. There are some studies suggest, particularly in educational psychology, find that lower sense of control often leads to stronger goal orientation towards avoidance. In our study, we also find similar results. So you can see in these figures, accumulation of resources, they tend to lead to increased sense of control, but losses kind of, you can see, it decreased the sense of control. A sense of control in turn, it was positively associated with growth orientation, but negatively associated with maintenance and loss avoidance orientation. So we propose a theoretical model to synthesize this hypothesis. In this model, we argue that several key evaluation processes that can be determining people's selection of goal orientation. So if a need, evaluation of a possibility and the losses. So this evaluation process can be influenced by factors such as experience of gains and losses, and satisfaction, and the sense of control. So those factors, they are going to decide or determine whether a person wants to strive for gains, for example, to learn a new skill, or want to select goals towards maintenance and loss avoidance, for example, to maintain the old skill and avoid from those new skills, for example, using the new technologies. So what's the implications for learning in adulthood? I will take the use of smartphone as an example. So based on this model, we have several general suggestions. One is to facilitate old adults' feeling of want and the need for using smartphone. Second, enhance old adults perceive the possibility of mastering a new skill, for example, using smartphone. The third, reduce the risk and threats of losses. Many old adults do not use smartphone or smartphone apps because they are not interested, as shown in a recent published survey. You can see over 50% of old adults and middle-aged and old adults in China, they do not use short video apps because they are not interested. So how to motivate old adults' interest to learn to use smartphone? So first of all, we need to figure out what they want. So according to what we discussed previously, for many, although maybe not for all old adults, learning new skills and acquiring something novel, exciting, not so important anymore in later adulthood. Comparatively, maintenance, for example, of personal interest and avoidance of losses, for example, avoidance of losses of connection to significant others become more important. So maybe it's a good idea to start with teaching old adults to do something of their interest on smartphones. For example, for males, we can teach them to watch news and amusing videos. For females, we can teach them to video chat with their beloved family members and friends who are spatially distant. Regarding enhancing the perceived possibility of mastering the new skill, objectively, we can reduce the objective difficulty of the use of smartphone and the apps. We can make the learning materials easy to understand and follow. Subjectively, we can enhance old sense of control. For example, we can let them start from the easiest operations, give them timely positive feedback to help them build up self-confidence. Regarding reduced risk and the threats of losses, there are a lot of things to consider. Like, for example, we can think about how to reduce the cost. We can think about how to reduce the fear of failures, because failure can make old adults feel frustrated and undermine their feeling of competence. And a lot of old adults also have the fear for losing faith. So for those old adults, we can think about leave them some time and space to learn and practice alone by themselves. And we can also let them know and teach them how telecom fraud and internet fraud victimization can be avoided by using smartphone properly, and so on. I would like to express my great thanks to my collaborators, Professor Alexander Freund, and the support from my previous lab. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gong, for your insightful talk. We have now concluded the initial keynote sessions, and we'll be moving on to the Q&A session. Here you can see the names and pictures of everybody who presented again. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the interface. And we already received a few questions, so we will begin with those. The first one is for Professor Freund. Do we have to change the narrative around work to make it feel less exhausting?
Sorry.
No.
Sorry. Yes, I do think we need to change the narrative because I believe that we're not doing ourselves a favor by thinking just like, oh my God, I worked 8 hours, so I must be exhausted. Because oftentimes the time doesn't tell us how exhausted we are. It tells us maybe we should be doing something else because we're stuck, because we don't make the kind of progress that we expected to make, and so on. And that makes us think about a much more flexible way of thinking about work. I am aware, of course, that not all work is, it's not possible in all types of work. There are very different work contexts where you cannot just say, okay, 5 minutes break, 10 minutes break. However, I do believe that even in, let's say, factory work, like the typical worker environments, we could change our thinking about how to deal with strict boundaries. And I know that Kurosh and I have, Professor Masudi and I might come to different conclusions, but I think our level of analysis is different. So I'm not even sure that we contradict each other. I think our level of analysis is different. And I also want to link it to Professor David's talk, because I do believe that some of the aspects such as self-verification are absolutely underestimated when we think about processes of, do you want to engage in work and how exhausted do you feel by it? If you get recognition for who you are, I think it's such an essential aspect of meaning making. So I haven't talked about this, but I think it's also very, very important to include these factors when we think about a changing workplace. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. I don't know, does any of the other speakers have something to add as well? If not, we can move on to the next question as well. It's already been answered in the chat partially, I saw, but I think it's still interesting to discuss in the bigger plenum. This will be for Professor David. Can you think of ways how co-working space owners can integrate your findings into the operation of their spaces and foster the positive aspects of this type of work setting?
Yeah, so yeah, I put some ideas into the chat box. I didn't know if we would run out of time, but basically the reciprocity ring that I was talking about, I think is a really good tool because I think you know, co-working spaces are famous for doing a lot of these things. They'll have a lot of guest speakers come in so they can have people do it, or they'll have, you know, networking kind of things. But I think a lot of times people just tend to keep to themselves, or they'll just do small talk. So the more that they can set up the structures for people to engage more meaningfully and to help each other. So going back to the reciprocity rings, it's just kind of having a message board saying, oh, I need a graphic designer to help me launch my new website. Can anyone in the community help me? And so people just start paying it forward with whatever skills that they have. And this could be a good way for people to, you know, go around and really help with the problems that other people have, but also get help because, you know, everyone's giving and receiving from the same community. And in terms of, since we found that the strongest one was emotional support, again, you know, just finding ways for people to connect on a better basis, maybe based on personality or other compatibility factors, even, you know, being in a similar industry. But again, finding ways to bring people together on a deeper level. And I think that could work wonders for people's vigor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more question as well. Professor Masudi, could you elaborate a bit on the management practices which facilitate adjustment to the new ways of work?
Yes, it's a very good question. We're still looking into it. In fact, we're trying to organize meetings with managers to see how this can be done. But I could say a few words about it. What we know mainly is that the intensity of, if you're talking, for instance, about telework or remote working, we know that the intensity of telework is important. That is, the beneficial effects of telework, giving more autonomy, better work-home balance, increases and saturates around 2 to 3 days per week, and then you have detrimental effects. So this, in these terms, we can organize telework in an alternating effect for people to come back to office and have some interactions. I think feedback is very important when being at distance, and managers should learn how to manage at distance. It's not the same job, so this is also a difficulty for them. And I think one thing that is very important also is not believing or having the conviction that Zoom meetings could replace social support. In fact, it is not. So you can't replace numerous Zoom meetings just to be in contact and see your colleagues by what people need in terms of interaction. So this could also bring managers to maybe organize less meetings, but more efficient, and monitoring people's work and performance, giving clear goals and clear points in time where people can see how their job is going on and how's the quality of the job that's done. So monitoring is also a very important thing in this matter. So these are the few ideas that I have for the moment.
Thank you very much. I saw that we have another question coming in. I'll quickly pose a question to Professor Gong, just so that we have everybody can answer something. And then if you have time, Professor Masudi, I'll ask you the final question as well before wrapping up. Professor Gong, maybe also speaking to what Professor Masudi spoke to, Zoom meetings obviously can't replace social interactions and support. And a lot of your work focused on the digital divide, which obviously has become a lot more important in recent years because it's gone from where maybe elder generations felt disadvantaged due to their lack of technical skills to us now in the last 2 years. Obviously, that's all that we've been doing. Have you found anything in particular that helps, for example, to support elder generations to gain this objective confidence in these technical skills, to be able to drive the desire? You said it also impacts their desire to learn new skills. Have you discovered any particular maybe support networks or ways in which these new technologies can be made more accessible maybe to those segments as well?
So actually, personally, I haven't done some studies directly about how to promote old adults to, like, for example, to learn the use of new technologies. But in general, so as I presented in my presentation, like I think the general direction can be, there could be several directions. One direction is that actually those engineer people who are developing new smartphones and apps and maybe robots, there are a lot of discussion about how to make the devices much easier for old adults to use. So, but it seems like it has not been considered so much. Is that what does the old adults want? What do the old adults want? So, how to motivate their engagement in the use of the devices and the technology. So, but that's one of the direction I think that we need to. I also want to do more research on this direction. So, in my future. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much for the answer. I'll just quickly ask Professor Masudi to give maybe a 30-second response to this final question. I will obviously forward the question to you as well in case Dan Peng would like to know more. So the question would be, recent study also showed some negative effects of helping for people who give help, what do you think of that if we encourage help in the workplace to those who give help? Maybe they're giving help at their own cost, such as having less time for themselves.
Well, it's a pretty good question. This is one part of our data I didn't talk about, but when I was talking about the vulnerable group that had more difficulties in maintaining sustainable careers, one of the personality traits that we identified that characterized this population was the agreeableness trait. And this is very counterintuitive because this is normally, it should be considered as a socially desirable state. We like people who are agreeable, who are altruistic, and who relate to others and want to help. But indeed, one could say also that in a very competitive labor market, it could become a vulnerability trait. So this is what I can say, that we do understand that, yes, of course, burnout was first invented for people who were in helping careers and who gave a lot to others and were exhausted emotionally, physically because of giving too much. And this is a great concern for us because we know during the pandemic that helping professions were heavily charged and heavily solicited, and we know that this should be considered.
Thank you very much for your insights. Yes, as previously mentioned, we are slightly over the time, so I think it's about time to wrap up this webinar. But at this point, I would just like to thank all of our speakers again, Professor Freund, David, Masudi, and Gong, for your insights. It was really appreciated, and I think everybody really enjoyed it as well. Thank you also to the audience for joining us and for submitting all your questions. If you have any further questions, of course, feel free to email us. You have the email on the Zoom behind you. It is academia.china@swissnext.org. And of course, also feel free to follow us on our social medias to stay up to date with our latest events and projects. Thank you, everybody, again for joining us. Wishing you a good remainder of your day or evening if you're in China. And yes, don't hesitate to contact us if you have any further questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.